Anti-Semitism has been on full display across the United States since Hamas attacked Israel last month, with supporters of the terrorist group spotted tearing down posters of the kidnapped Israeli children. Now, on October 7th, there was more than 240 innocent civilians that were abducted from Israel into the Gaza Strip. Their whereabouts remain unknown. More than 8,500 men, women, and children, ranging in ages from as little as 3 months to as old as 85 years old, were wounded, killed, beaten, abused, and brutally separated from their loved ones in Hamas. Here is the list that those tearing down posters don't want you to see. I'm going to go through each and every single one of these, and if you support this video and support these hostages being returned to their loved ones, please do me a favor, like this video, share it out so that way this can be seen. One last thing that I typically don't ask, just let this video play. Let the names be heard. Each and every single person on this list is important from the first to the last. God bless. Margaret Moses, 78 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Doran Katz Asher, 34 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Aviv Katz Asher, 2 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Raz Katz Asher, 4 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Gadi Moses, 80 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Soshan Haran, 65 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. The Shohan family, Tal, 38, Adi, 38, Navi, 8, Yahel, 3, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Kafir Bibas, 10 months old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Shiri Bibas, 32 years old, Yarden Bibas, 34 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Moran Stella Yani, 40 years old, kidnapped from the music festival by Hamas. Ariel Bibas, 4 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Gad Hagi, 73 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Judith Weinstein, 70 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Chaim Perry, 79 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Ada Sagi, 75 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Amiram Cooper, 84 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Elda Katskir, 47 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Maya Gorin, 56 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Hannah Katskir, 77 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Ophelia Reutman, 77 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Tammy Metzger, 78 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Yoran Metzger, 80 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Omer Nutra, 22 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ella Eliakim, 8 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Daphna Eliakim, 15 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Yarden Roman Gatz, 36 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Liri Albag, 18 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Amelia Aloni, 5 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Emma and Yuli Cunino, 3 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Sharon Aloni Cunio, 34 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. David Cunio, 33 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Ariel Cunio, 26 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Amit Shanai, 16 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Tal Shalev, 54 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. David Shalev, 75 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Tamir Adar, 38 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Mirav Tal, 53 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Yair Yaakov, 59 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Yafa Adar, 85 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Ohad Yahalami, 49 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Eaton Yahalami, 12 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Evyatar David, 22 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Sahardan Calderon, 16 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Erez Dan Caldron, 12 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Ofer Caldron, 53 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Itzker El Garat, 68 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Shanai Gorin, 29 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Matan Zagakur, 23 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Diza Hyman, 84 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Jimmy Pacheco, 33 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Tal Jaime, 41 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Abigail Eden, 3 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Both her parents were murdered. Tamar Shootman, 77 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Noga Wise, 18 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Karina Ariv, 19 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Yossi Sharabi, 52 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Keith Samuel Siegel, 64 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Adrian Aviva Siegel, 62 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Mia Laneberg, 17 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Clara Marmon, 63 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Fernando Marmon, 60 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Luis Norberto Har, 70 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Daniela Gilboa, 19 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Danielle Aloni, 43 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Ramon Kirsch, 36 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Amre Miram, 46 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Elijah Cohen, 27 years old, kidnapped from the music festival by Hamas. Yagev Bushtad, 34 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Adina Moshe, 72 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Gabriela Limberg, 59 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Ron Sherman, 19 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Elma Avraham, 84 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Alan Ohel, 22 years old, kidnapped from the music festival by Hamas. Carmel Gatt, 39 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Nick Beezer, 19 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Noam Avigdori, 12 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Sharon Avigdori, 52 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Lior Rudolph, 61 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Or Levi, 33 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Hirsch Goldberg Poland, 23 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Sherry Wise, 53 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Omar Wenkert, 22 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Mia Shem, 21 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Loren Daphna Garkovich, 47 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Maya Regev, 21 years old, Itai Regev, 18 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. No Marciano, 19 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Omer Shem Tov, 21 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Ohad Ben Ami, 54 years old, Raz Ben Ami, 57 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Ophir Engel, 17 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Ivan Ilarmendi, 47 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Almag Mirjan, 21 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Dolev Yehod, 35 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Arbel Yehod, 28 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Eden Yerushlami, 24 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Eaton Horn, 37 years old. Yayar Horn, 45 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Amit Esther Buskila, 38 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Itai Sveritsky, 38 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Elkana Bobut, 33 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Noah Agramani, 26 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Evanatan Orr, 30 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Alexander Danzig, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Mika Engel, 18 years old, Karina Engel, 53 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Uval Engel, 11 years old, Ronan Engel, 53 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Yana Grzetsky Kamhai and Orion Hernandez Pado, 30 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Sejev Kalfan, 25 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Shlomo Mansour, 85 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Bipin Ghoshi, 23 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Eden Alexander, 19 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ophir Safari, 27 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Tomer Ahimas, 20 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Sasha Alexander Trofanov, 27 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Irina Tati, 73 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Elena Trofanov, 50 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Sapir Cohen, 29 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Eden Zakaria, 28 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Eaton Avraham Moore, 23 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Ohad Mundar Zitri, 9 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Avraham and Ruth Mundur, 78 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Karen Mundur, 54 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Guy Gilboa Dalal, 22 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Shania Luke, 23 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Bar Kuperstein, 21 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Agam Berger, 19 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Yotam Hayim, 28 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Ziv and Gali Berman, 26 years old, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Naima Levi, 19 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Nadav Popplewell, 51 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Hannah Perry, 79 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Yosef Chaim Ohana, 23 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. The Brodach family, Hagar, 39, Ofri, 10, Yuval, 8, Oriya, 4, kidnapped from their home by Hamas. Itay Chen, 19 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Sujith Nisanka, 48 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Joshua Loitu Molel, 21 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Matan Engris, 21 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Aviv Atzili, 49 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Liat Benin Atzili, 49 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Uriel Baruch, 35 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Ron Benjamin, 53 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Rom Braslavsky, 19 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Ben Benjamin Cohen, 27 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Nimrod Cohen, 19 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ori Danino, 24 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Sagwi Dekel Chen, 35 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ronnie Eshel, 19 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Shania Gabe, 26 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Oren Golden, 34 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Agam Goldstein Almog, 17 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Chen Goldstein Almog, 49 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Gal Goldstein Almog, 11 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Tal Goldstein Almog, 9 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Rami Golden, 23 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ron Javili, 24 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Inbar Heyman, 27 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Maxim Hirkin, 35 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Tisachi Eden, 51 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Guy Iluz, 26 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Dror Kaplun, 68 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Daniil Kaimenfeld, 65 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Andrei Koslov, 27 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ronnie Kravoy, 25 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Eaton Levi, 53 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Eliakim Shlomo Libin, 24 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Alex Lobanov, 32 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Neely Margalit, 41 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Tamir Nimradi, 19 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Michael Nisembaum, 59 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Alma Or, 13 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Dror Or, 48 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Liam Or, 18 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Noam Or, 17 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ronnie Petrovitsky, 24 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Hila Rotem Shoshani, 13 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Raya Rotem, 54 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Yonatan Mordechai Samarano, 21 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Alan Lulu Shamariz, 26 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Eli Sharabi, 51 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Eden Shtitvai, 28 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Vivian Silver, 74 years old, kidnapped from her home by Hamas. Amit Susanna, 40 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Doran Steinbrecher, 30 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ilan Wise, 56 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Elia Toledano, 27 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Channon Yablanka, 42 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Ari Zalmanovich, 85 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Shlomi Ziv, 43 years old, kidnapped from a music festival by Hamas. Natawari Monkan, 35 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Nathavari Molkan, kidnapped by Hamas. Buntham Fakan, kidnapped by Hamas. Bansha Ducha Arawach, 29 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Gong Se Lo, 26 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Tu Se Li, 38 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Pongsek Tayena, kidnapped by Hamas. Clements Felix Mentanga, 22 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Dua Sayeng, 35 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Wichai Kalapat, 28 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Monkol Fachuban, kidnapped by Hamas. Dawatachi Saitao, 26 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Sathian Suwankam, 34 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Yegal Jacob, 12 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Or Jacob, 16 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Almog Saruzi, 26 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Iska Jelarenter, 56 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Noralin Agajo, 60 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Gali Tarashansky, 13 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Komkritz Chombua, 29 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. Ravid Katz, 51 years old, kidnapped from his home by Hamas. Emily Tony Korenberg-Han, 9 years old, kidnapped by Hamas. And again, our thoughts and prayers go out to these hostages and their families. We pray that there is an end to the conflict soon, and I'll be sure to keep you guys up to date on everything as it unfolds. Thank you for joining me. I'll catch you in the next video. Take care. God bless. This is Steve.